Hi, this is Greg Remke. I direct education programs for economic thinking, a nonprofit in Seattle. This is part two of a presentation given to students at IES Europe in Aix-en-Provence in July, Entrepreneurship, Enterprises, and the Environment. Part one, I looked more at oysters, at shellfish, at offshore ecosystems, and efforts to recover oyster beds off of around Europe and the U.S., and the economic principles involved. Now I'm switching sort of to beef, so switching from shellfish to ruminants. I ended with a slide with Frederick Bastiat from Economic Harmonies, where he talks about the animals that exist reproduce in immense numbers, and he has the example of oysters, huge consumption of oysters at that time in Europe, and yet still there's plenty of oysters. And he talks about rich countries also can increase the amount of food and beef and so forth. He mentions in particular harder to reproduce, but he says we could produce 10 times as many, far more. And even today, when agricultural productivity around the world is far higher, population is far higher, through technology, knowledge, coordination, and markets, we can dramatically increase the food produced on land and in the ocean, and the quality, the nutrient density. And that's what I'll be discussing in this session. So economic principles are about incentives and information. We have incentive problems. How do you get people, to work hard and productively? Information problems. What should people do? How are you going to run a farm? If you've got a plot of land, what's the best way to develop it for crops, for animals? Similarly, in the water, the market processes are about coordination among the producers of goods and services, and creating incentives for people to work together. So for land, what's the good use for land, better or best use? Where I am, there used to be farmland east of us in the Kent Valley, and now it's all retail and warehouses and companies, but no farms. Should it have stayed farms? Is it better where it is now? How are these decisions made about land use, whether it's agriculture or retail or housing? And then, even if that decision's made, what crops should be grown? How should they be grown? Should you have more wind and solar installations, more factories, or just more farmland? Or land left to wilderness, forest land where people can go hiking. It doesn't all have to have the trees cut down for wood. There can be wilderness areas too. So how do you make the decisions between which areas are for wilderness ecosystems, which for agriculture, which for housing? And then, given that the STOA League has agriculture as their debate topic this year, how best do we figure out how to manage agriculture, how to increase productivity, reduce costs, reduce subsidies, and so forth? Well, one thing to look at here, so this is a prairie system. So you can have farms in Kansas, or you can have prairie. And maybe you've got wild buffalo grazing, in Montana on the land, or you have cows grazing on the grasses. But we see what's above the ground. We don't see what's below unless we dig into it. So this is a look at the root system of prairie plants, which is a big part of this movement toward regenerative agriculture, and the depth of the roots and the invisibles, which are the billions of microbes that are doing a lot of work around the rhizome, around those root systems. So what's the best way to raise cattle, manage farms, grow crops? So there's a series of videos you can see on YouTube, carbon cowboys, roots so deep, soil carbon cowboys sometimes, but there's a discussion of droughts and flooding and the role of regenerative ranching and agriculture to reduce flooding. Now, another way to reduce flooding is to build dams and to build levees in areas where heavy rains, the water can be held along the Mississippi River. There's these big tracts of land that get flooded when the Mississippi rises dramatically. So managing water has been part of civilization since the first dams were built. In addition to dams, soil can manage flooding. So when you've got soil that is open by hoof impact from cattle or buffalo or other ruminants, and you've got these deep, deep roots, and you've got the plants that are a foot or more in the air, when a heavy downpour comes, it hits the plants, the roots hold the soil in place, the water goes some 6 inches or more of rain can go straight into the soil. That allows it to stay cool and moist longer, as well as reduces runoff where you lose soil and fertilizers for those using it. So another part of what's going on is that regenerative ranching and agriculture, these deep root systems, the sun is shining on the plants are absorbing CO2 out of the atmosphere, mixing with sunlight and water and nutrients, and they are sending carbohydrates into the soil to feed the rhizome, to feed the microbes. So, for example, cattle come through and graze on these grasses and forbs, and that's interpreted as damage. So the cows move on, the plant is damaged by the grazing. The plant signals the microbes to go get new nutrients because the plant has to rebuild. So the plant is absorbing more sunlight, which is cooling the soil, sending more carbohydrates into the soil to feed the microbes. The microbes are bringing more needed nutrients out of the soil to help the plants regrow. So regenerative ranching and agriculture is now becoming more and more profitable. Farmers have learned, no-till, low-till soils, as well as cover crops and rotation to restore the nutrient density. Originally, these were more sort of nonprofit and environmental things, back to the earth and so forth. Now they're becoming profitable enterprises by farmers who, may or may not care about the quality of the ecosystem. They care about the ability of their farm or ranch to generate profits. So they're drought resistant. Irrigation is a cost, and going a long time without water is a cost. But if your land can keep and hold the downpours that come, you're more drought resistant because of the roots and the moisture underground. And they're flood resistant. The water doesn't flow off and take your topsoil with it because, again, it's more absorbed by your open ground. Much cooler temperatures. They're carbon sinks, too. A significant amount of CO2 is sequestered into the soil. So you've got nutrient-dense, microbe-fed plants that are healthier, that make for healthier animals and people. So here's an example. One of the videos, this guy's driving through his soil and explaining that he's getting a minimum of like 15 degrees cooler on his property because his plants and forbs are higher in the air. They're absorbing more of the sun and absorbing more CO2, turning it into carbohydrates. That keeps the soil down, the soil moist and beneficial. Soil microbes are the key, and if the land gets too hot, you're hardening the soil and killing the microbes. So this is for the EU, 4.5 to 27 metric tons of CO2 per hectare per year sequestered into the soil. So books on this that I recommend: The Hidden Half of Nature by David Montgomery and Ann Bickel, looking at the microbes, how the key for gardens or crops is to have rich, nutrient-dense soil, and microbes are key to that, but we don't see the microbes. We don't think about them unless we dig in and look for them. And too much pesticides, too hot a sun can damage the microbes, or even tilling the soil can overturn the microbes. So farmers are going to low-till and no-till soil to not disturb the root systems and the microbes as much. Growing a Revolution is David Montgomery's earlier book, where he looks at how farmers in Kansas and around the country are trying these regenerative practices, not because they're environmentalists, not because an environmentalist pushed them to do that, but because they're making money on that. He claims that you can tell by the John Deere dealerships that are full of shiny new tractors around farms that have transitioned to this regenerative agriculture. And by the way, even though the latest administration is pushing money to regenerative agriculture, that sort of top-down funding, I would argue, is less effective than just sunsetting the massive subsidies that go to the big commodity crop producers, which I talk about in separate videos. For the US and the EU, same thing. You've got giant state and EU subsidies that slow the process of moving to farming that is in itself profitable. In what your food ate, it matters the nutrient density of the soil, because that impacts the nutrient density of the crops, carrots, onion, maybe a radish on the right there, and the nutrient density of the animals that eat the food, whether it's cattle, chicken, or people. So there's interviews with David Montgomery and Ann Bickel. They're academics at the University of Washington with different background fields. And in this video interview, they're talking about human health. The chronic disease epidemic in the U.S., they argue, is contributed to by the reduced nutrient quality of the food we eat. So that's part of the story they're telling as this regenerative agriculture and ranching movement is expanding. So here's part of the data on that. This is Professor Grant Schofield in a video that's at the Low Carb Down Under website, an Australian nutrient or nutrition website. Average mineral content of cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach have declined 80 to 90% over the last century. Calcium levels, magnesium, iron have dropped dramatically over the years, and this is because the soil quality has been reduced as people have damaged the microbes and the root system in the soils that grow our grains and vegetables. So around the world, 5 billion people don't get enough iodine, enough vitamin E and calcium. More than 4 billion don't have enough iron, riboflavin, folate. So these are all related to declining soil quality. We've ramped up production. The Green Revolution, we're producing a lot more food. People that might have starved to death instead are getting access to food, but less and less nutrient-dense food, and that requires some reforms and technology changes around the world. Here again, selected nutrients in broccoli declined significantly over 1975 to 97, 22 years. Why has it gone down? Well, the soil quality has gone down. Or we fertilize to get larger quantities, bigger vegetables, but they're bigger in terms of starch, but not bigger in terms of nutrient. So again, lots of food around the world, more than there used to be. Mexico, South America, Africa, India, Pakistan. However, significant iron deficiency, vitamin A, and iron deficiency, iodine, vitamin deficiency, the different colors of green. So we need to improve the soils, to improve the crops, to improve human health. People are stunted around the world because their mothers aren't getting the nutrients they need through pregnancy, and the children aren't getting the nutrients they need when they're little. They're getting the calories often, but not the nutrients. So an egg, for example, in India would be key for children, although many, somehow, some reason oppose eggs. So food's becoming less nutrient in the garden, carrots here, and there's a discussion of this, more fertilizer, but less nutrients. So it's a challenge. Again, we've had success increasing yields. Here's crop yield 61 to 2016, tremendously more calories per hectare, crops, corn, soybean, rice, wheat, sorghum, millet. So productivity up in terms of calories, but we've sort of stretched to, and not because of reducing soil quality and increasing yields, there aren't enough nutrients. So now we fortify crops in the U.S., which is not as healthy as having better soils. So there's a counter-agricultural revolution where environmentalists and maybe crazy people are saying, let's abolish farming altogether. We can, I don't know, have a vegetable garden at home. It's not clear, but you can read this. There are people who are sort of anti-technology, anti-farming, as well as top-down dictates in the European Union and Sri Lanka and other places where they're trying to push organic agriculture, but you need to have the productivity to feed people. So stepping back, what do we want for civilization? We want peace, prosperity, and human flourishing. But for human flourishing, we need to have healthy humans. We need to have people who are consuming nutrient-dense foods so that you're not just feeding them calories, but you're actually giving them the micronutrients they need, not just the macronutrients. So what nutrition do we need for healthy lives? Well, that impacts agricultural policy for the U.S. as well as in Europe, EU policies. What foods should be promoted? World Health Organization, European Union, what are they pushing for their views of the way agriculture should be? And the same in the U.S. What is the federal government pushing with its farm programs, with its subsidies for commodity crops, or the federal dietary guidelines? Should we eat a lot of grains and a lot of snacks and vegetables and fruit? Should we have meat, fish, cream, eggs? Is saturated fat good or bad? Those are strangely still science and policy questions. Here's a quote from Adam Smith, not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. So whether environmentalists or farmers, people are trying to achieve their goals. For ranchers and farmers, they're trying to make money. They're trying to make sure that their cost of production, the taxes, the labor costs, the raw materials, that the value of what they produce, either crops raised or animals sold, whether they can cover their costs. So this involves a learning process to learn which crops work best for them, to adapt when the climate changes or adapt when the different animals are available. So we want nutrient-dense, protein-rich, high-fat foods according to a whole range of scientists and researchers to feed brain energetic, resilient societies. However, United States agricultural policy and European agricultural policies often go against this. They're critical, for example, of animals. So saying we're terrible for the planet to be eating meat because it takes so much more grain than if we just ate the grain directly and things like that. And we'll discuss and debate this, but this is relevant for the success of people in Europe, America, and around the world. So we've got in the European Union, the U.S., there's state, federal policies for industry and agriculture. The U.S. and the EU have regional, national, federal subsidies for industry. They're trying to also to advance environmental goals. So this is part of the energy transition, getting companies to use renewable energy, getting farms to use renewable energy. This wind-solar transition is a challenge for Europe. U.S. policy is currently, at least at the top level, the Trump administration is trying to stop and back out of most of that, but it's still popular at the state levels, depending on the state, and it's still popular in the European Union. The wind renewable energy is raising costs for energy, and it makes the grid more fragile. And it's interesting, they talk about wind farms and solar farms. Well, no, farms are farms. Wind installations and solar industry installations are, factories, not farms. But again, the people use different language to promote their ideas. If it's the goal to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or to slow the increase, agricultural practices can do that in a big way through the carbon sequestration that's part of regenerative ranching and farming. So sort of the question is, if they're spending all this money trying to promote wind and solar and getting factories to use less fossil fuels, maybe they could achieve that result or more by encouraging or at least not punishing regenerative ranching and agriculture. And we have a story of the very expensive billions and billions of dollars subsidizing big farm corporations and farmers in the EU and in the US. In New Zealand, they just pushed the button. They abolished all their farm subsidies. Many people expected the worst. Instead, there was a resurgence of innovation, and New Zealand's become a leader for the world in ranching and farming because farmers are entrepreneurial. They're figuring out how to adapt their production processes for what profits them the most, and that it requires them to take care of the land. They need to have healthy land, to have healthy animals and crops to serve the public. And the same reforms could happen in the EU and the US. Farmers would be better off once the transition takes place. Costs would go down, food would be healthier, taxpayers would be better off. At least that's the argument that economists make in various books, researches, and studies. Here's a French farmer who's trying to deal with his dairy farm, and he's just got a mountain of paperwork from managing this organic farm. He's got all this money thrown at him by the EU, and just deregulating it, getting rid of the paperwork. You could also get rid of the subsidies. He'd be fine without it, he claims. Similarly, in the US, a neat video on isit.org looks at New Zealand farmers, how they're innovating to manage their cows better, dairy cows and others, cool next-gen farming. And again, discussion of this inventing, this entrepreneurship can improve the environment, improve the ecosystem, improve productivity, and save taxpayer dollars. Now, the European Union has a big regenerative agriculture project, One Planet Business for Biodiversity project, funded by the World Business Council, 250 leading companies. So they're on board with, reforming agriculture. But what they mean by regenerative agriculture isn't necessarily what farmers on the ground mean. You can see this is supported by a whole bunch of food processing companies and others, and that's fine. But what we want, ideally, you wouldn't need top-down plans for this. People would be able to innovate on their own. You can read more about this at the Dublin Declaration, which argues in favor of meat, particularly ruminants and cattle, for restoring the ecosystem, and livestock farming, global agri-food systems and diets. They're talking about the health benefits of meat as well as the benefits to the environment. And that goes against many ecologists, environmentalists, animal rights people, vegans, vegetarians. So you sort of got a battle between the carnivores and the ancestral eating and the vegans and vegetarian, and people should be able to eat what they want to, but federal policy, state policies, if they favor one to another, I would argue are problematic. So for the U.S. debaters that have changing federal agricultural policy, sorting this stuff out would be beneficial. And this is Stossel in the classroom. They have something called Both Sides of the Issue, where instead of them trying to sketch out both sides, they go out and find videos by advocates. So this one from Vox is saying, titled, Why Beef is the Worst Food for the Climate, because, it's inefficient compared to grains and other products, and they make the case for why beef is bad. Here's another one from Stossel in the classroom. They're saying beef is good, and here's why. So you want to look at studies, but here's two video overviews with advocates, both for and against beef. I'll be talking about the benefits of beef that come from, whether you eat the cattle or not, the ruminants on the ground are amazingly beneficial for the planet. Here's an example, Birdwell and Clark Ranch in Texas. So here's a place they get 32 inches of rain annually, but they don't get steady rain through the year. They get huge downpours. So they have to have a way to hold the rain in when it rains hard. And we'll talk a little bit about that happens. But you can see their video online as they describe how it works. They talk about herd impact. The innovation here was to increase the number of cattle raised on the land by 50%, by having them close together, moving from paddock to paddock, multi-paddock grazing. And the argument is their hoofs would break up the soil. The short time there would drop a lot of fertilizer on the land. They would enjoy eating the crops or the grains and the forbs, but then move on in a few hours to new, so they wouldn't damage the grass so much that it took a long time to recover. And then they wouldn't come back to that same paddock for, a couple months, up to 80 days. So roots so deep. Here's another one in Georgia, 100,000 beating hearts. Similar story of a cattle guy who switched from traditional feedlot cattle raising to more open grazing, and he found tremendous benefits mixing in other animals and chicken with the crops, with the beef grazing, hiring dozens and dozens of people to run his operation. And so now he's got a regenerative ranch that he argues is better for the environment and more profitable once he did the transition. And again, it's sequestering vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the soil. Whether you care about that or not, it's just part of the process of having healthy farmland and ranchland. So this is Dr. Peter Ballerstadt talking about forage livestock systems, why this is healthier for the world. He jokes that he's part of a secret society called the Ruminati. These are people who promote ruminants. But if you look back through human history, my earlier talk, I mentioned there's oysters in ancient Greece and oysters in ancient Rome. But there's also cattle, and so cattle is part of the process of all the early societies. Ruminants, and the Native Americans, buffalo roaming the United States and managed by Native American tribes, and they change. It's part of the ecosystem adapting to the ruminants, and this is a key part of the world. They're saying, and something we should understand the benefits of this, both consuming meat that are healthy, but also, they argue, but also healthy for the ground. And here, articles recently from Western China where they're introducing this Przewalski's horse, the only wild horse still in the world, was wiped out in China when, lack of property rights and rifles allowed them to kill the horses. Some were captured and put in a zoo, I think in the 1800s or early 1900s. And those zoo animals are being reintroduced in Western China where the desert has expanded. And the argument is that the animals themselves, the horses will counteract the desert as they raise and graze. They break up the soil. They drop fertilizer. The stuff they drop has all these seeds in it, and there's up to 900 of them now that are doing the process of bringing back the rangeland, the prairie in a sense, that is desertified once the animals were killed. Similarly, the bison are expanding in Yellowstone, and what researchers are finding is the grasses are responding. The thudding buffalo that come through, they tear up they open up the soil, they drop excrement that has the grass seeds in it, and the soil changes over time as they're going back and forth. They have a particular pattern of where they graze that researchers are finding. So whether you have cattle you're raising for for meat or for dairy, or whether you've got wild animals, buffaloes, you're changing the ecosystem and sequestering massive amounts of CO2 in the ground. Maybe that's a less expensive, more effective way to slow CO2 increases rather than, the wind and the solar and some of the other mandates we have. That would be a matter for further research. Switching gears a little bit, a big story in the status quo is the water crisis. They're meeting right now to reduce the water allocation to states along the Colorado River. The argument is drought is making things worse. Parts of Texas, as well as the Ogallala Aquifer above Kansas, as well as in the west. And however, turns out this is an article from Scientific American. There's people growing crops. Part of U.S. agricultural policy is subsidizing the water and subsidizing cotton production. So if you fly out of Phoenix, you see green in the hills. They're planting cotton out there. Why? People aren't allowed to, have lawns, but they're growing cotton. Well, critics say the federal subsidies of the big crops, cotton among them, and providing water below market costs, what it would be valued at by people, is depleting the water. And there's plenty of water, or there would be if we weren't subsidizing so much. Similar story. I don't know if do I have the similar story here in California. So the water goes down the Colorado River. It gets to the farmlands in the south of California, and they're growing three crops of alfalfa in the desert in Southern California with water that comes from the Columbia. And the last one, in the heat of the summer, they're watering this desert land to grow alfalfa. Where does the alfalfa go? It gets shipped to China to feed cows in China. So this is at taxpayer expense, subsidizing alfalfa growth, and maybe one crop makes money, but the third one's through the summer because it's so hot and sunny in California. If you can get water, you can keep growing crops. But if you're paying a market price for the water, would the crops be profitable? And what's the benefit to us for sending this money at taxpayer expense to China? So I argue in my post on this that in cases similarly in Georgia where peanuts are subsidized, the water out of the Chattahoochee River doesn't get to the coast in Florida, and so the oysters die there because there's not enough fresh water. Well, who decides what the most value of water is? And economists argue you have a price on water. Water flows uphill toward money, and why not allow water to go to suburbs in California instead of farms if the farms aren't able to pay for the water? Similarly, in Northern California, your people are growing rice in the desert west of Sacramento. Why? Well, because the water rights aren't clear. So just ending the agriculture part here, here's the story of New Zealand. This is from 10 years ago, just how New Zealand farmers, once the subsidies were ended, they changed their farm policies, and instead of having government tell them what to do, that went out of the window overnight. New Zealand's now a powerhouse in agricultural production, and they give a little about the history of this. In 1984, they eliminated some 30 different agricultural production subsidies and export incentives, and the results were phenomenal and successful. Once those were gone, farmers shifted to things that would make money. They've cut costs, diversified land use. Now over 2,000 products from about 35 before, all sorts of cool things. Wine industry has expanded. So this is an example of what would happen as you phased out agricultural subsidies, regulations, mandates, and taxes from U.S. farmers and from EU farmers and ranchers. More on the nutrient-dense history here, and I've covered part of the title, but it's a nutrient-dense history of civilization, animals, fish, olives, nuts. What did our ancestors eat? This is the Eastern Shore Food Lab, where they're sort of archaeologists as well as experimenting on which foods are nutrient dense. And people adapted not just hunting, fishing, and animal husbandry, but also fermenting food. There was food processes, but it was mainly much on fermentation, preserving food. Fermentation means microbes. So back to the microbes in the soil, microbes in the water around the oysters, microbes in our body, and microbes preserving the food. They're finding now that when people eat fermented foods, that leads to new microbes, healthy microbes to grow in our gut that weren't there before. So today's nutritionists, there's tribes. One tribe is against animals, against eggs, against butter. It's too unhealthy, against saturated fat. So it's this battle between the plant people and the meat people. And all I can encourage is for students to do their own research and try and find out, what diets work for them. But critics say this obesity epidemic in the U.S., which is, downstream from insulin resistance and poor metabolic health, comes from the federally subsidized commodity crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, sorghum, even dairy subsidized, but also regulated. The argument is that the calorie-dense foods that the government was funding are not as good for us as nutrient-dense foods would be. So we've got federal policies that are both promoting processed foods through the SNAP program for poor people, the food that is the worst for them in terms of their health, as well as subsidizing the crops that aren't the best for people. And again, I keep saying finishing off, but finishing off again, we have an obesity and diabetes epidemic in the US and in the UK. Here are two major organizations, Diabetes.uk and the American Diabetes Association, that are advising people on how to deal with diabetes. Here's the picture here. Looks like there may be a carrot and a cabbage or cauliflower for dinner. And here's the lady from the American Diabetes Association advising people in their education thing with diabetes to eat plenty of grains and oatmeal and just cover it with insulin. Critics of that saying this is crazy. This is the alternate diabetes organization in the UK with a picture of Dr. David Unwin. They're saying diabetes isn't a chronic disease that needs to be forever treated with metformin and insulin. Instead, if you change your diet, for a whole lot of people, diabetes goes away. If you're pre-diabetic, you just reduce carbohydrates and starches, your diabetes goes into remission. Dr. Unwin, 150 of his patients now have their type 2 diabetes has gone completely into remission as they changed their diet and as they got a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, that monitored their blood glucose levels. So they could tell what foods caused blood glucose to skyrocket and insulin to skyrocket, which is what is eventually the cause of diabetes. In the U.S., Nina Teicholz is critical of the American Diabetes Association, which she notes is funded by the food industry, pharmaceutical industry, and donations and government. Instead, there's the American Diabetes Society now, a new one, that says if you want to resolve diabetes and prediabetes, change your diet. I originally watched Nina Teicholz give a talk for the Cato Institute where she talked about the history of the federal dietary guideline. I stopped eating breakfast. I was always having oatmeal and blueberries like my dad did, or Raisin Bran, which I learned had 17 grams of sugar in Raisin Bran. I thought it was healthy for me, I guess because it didn't taste that good. Instead, it wasn't healthy. I switched to eating eggs, meat, cheese, dairy, butter, and I lost 20 pounds in 1 month, another 20 pounds over the next 6 months, and my blood glucose level stabilized. My hemoglobin A1C got better. Basically, I was pre-diabetic and didn't know it until I later looked at the blood tests, and that was 6 years ago now. So it wasn't a strict diet. I simply didn't eat things that didn't taste good to me. I didn't eat pizza, although pizza can be good, but I had food that tasted good. And Terence Keeley talks about this in his book, Breakfast is a Dangerous Meal. He found out he was type 2 diabetic, even though he was slim and thought he was eating healthy, again, following the UK dietary guidelines. So I write about some of this in a Goodman Institute paper, Did the Government Make Us Fat?, critical of the federal dietary guidelines. When those went in, our diet changed. The government was saying, eat more carbs, eat a lot more meals. We got obese from that. That fed into the, big pasta or the grain industry. They like that. And they're the ones getting subsidized. But for our health, that wasn't a good thing in the US or in Europe. So there's more books about this. John Mackey, founder of Whole Foods Market, has the Whole Foods diet, and he is very much in the vegetarian, vegan world. But regardless of what you're eating, you need to have proper nutrient density. You need protein and the amino acids that your body needs. Those are harder to get from plants, but you can get them from plants, particularly when the food is cooked and fermented so as to release the nutrients. Catherine Shanahan, with her book, Deep Nutrition, her second book, Dark Calories, is very skeptical of vegans and vegetarians, and particularly of seed oils, of vegetable oils, and in favor of traditional eating, meat and so forth. And so she explains that and the science of it. Casey Means, Good Energy, is a more popular book on that. These books on food, one author who's interviewed here, he writes, he goes, visits his brother in Chile, has an Argentine steak, and he's just shocked at how good it tastes. He's never had anything that tasteful. And he writes a whole book on steak. And the reason it tasted so good is it was incredibly nutrient dense. And then he writes more about the food industry trying to put the good taste into corn chips or Doritos without the nutrient density. So how could you mimic the taste of a steak or a nutrient-dense nixtamalized corn chip without the nutrients? And that's what those books are about. Pellagra. So corn is very dangerous unless the nutrients are released. This is a disease, pellagra, that was considered an infectious disease until it was discovered that it was caused by corn. And it was dealt with differently in the U.S. and in Italy, and that's an important story for nutrition and the dietary guidelines. So, key thing here is in Italy, when they had pellagra in the north, they recognized it was from corn, and they had to supplement people's diet with fish and other things so they got their nutrients covered, particularly vitamin A, I think. U.S. didn't do that. Instead, we went toward fortification. So we have sort of foods that are so processed they lack the nutrients, and then we fortify them with nutrients, and that's not as healthy as having diets that actually have the full nutrient range in them. Okay, he talks about that here. Let me end now. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have questions, please feel free to email. Finishing with a story about pulling CO2 from the atmosphere. Here's a fig tree that pulls CO2 in the atmosphere and makes stone out of it, calcium carbonate. Similarly, the other CO2 goes into the soil for feeding the organic. So what's healthy? Sunshine, salt, saturated fat, nutrient density. Thank you very much for listening.